Hello everyone, today we're going to be covering another search bar implementation for Ruby on Rails. This one's going to be using Elasticsearch and Searchkick again, but this time we're going to have a little bit of autocomplete happening. This will work with a drop-down that we can use, and if we come over here and we search for something, I don't know, like the word water, you'll see that we get the many waters appearing. And if we very quickly search for water, you'll see that we're not hitting the database multiple times. But if we were to do something like WATER, that will go through all those results one at a time. So it allows the user to type out what they need to without hitting the database a bunch. So we're debouncing the requests. And then of course, if we want to go to like the test post right here, we can click on it. You see that takes us there. We come back, it's still persisting, but anytime we click off, it will get rid of that. Now the other thing we can do is we can search for, I think it's like brand. And that will also give us results where if, like in this case, if we click on the body, you'll see it doesn't have the word brand in it, but it does have bland. So it's matching it with like a one-letter typo almost, which is a neat touch. And of course, we can also search for like, yeah, there we go, francois. So let's go with like RAN. And you'll see we're getting those partial matches. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be using a Docker container. It's going to be great. And hopefully I won't mess things up too much. I'm gonna go ahead and CD out of here, and I'm going to make sure I don't have a video in here, which I do. So I need to do a rm-rf for the video project, and then we'll do a F11, and we'll say, let's make a Rails new video with a -J of ESBuild and a -C of, let's say, Tailwind this time, just to keep things fresh. While that's running, I can talk to you about Docker. Basically, we're gonna have the Windows Docker application up and running. If you go and install it, you can click the little cogwheel and choose use the WSL2 engine, which will let you use Docker inside of your WSL instance. In my case, I can also go ahead and delete this. And then to remake this Docker container, you can come over to this Universal Elastic repo that I have, where we have a command to set up this Elasticsearch container in one command. So to do that, let's CD into our video, and then let's paste in that Docker run command, which will run it on port 9200. We can go ahead and run this. This will create the Docker container. It'll take a little bit to start up, but we can then go over to localhost port 9200. And once this is up and running, which we'll see over here, we'll then be able to see that Elasticsearch is working. So let's make sure that we're actually doing this in a VS Code instance before I forget. And then we're going to have to do a little bit of hacking right now because of the current state of things, because as you know, Rails is always in flux. So we're going to come over to the gem file, and the first thing we need to do is we need to do the Searchkick gem, the Elasticsearch, and the Faker gem, right? So we get the Searchkick gem. We need to do gem for Elasticsearch. You see right up here, we just got the Elasticsearch Docker container appeared. So that's pretty cool. I don't know if it's the Elasticsearch model. I think it's just Elasticsearch. So we need the Elasticsearch with a comma, and we need the version to be, I believe, 7.17. By default, it'll try to add like version 8, which doesn't work right now. And then the last thing we're going to do is the Faker gem. Now, because I'm on Ruby 3.2, it doesn't have foreman support yet. So we have to add the gem foreman from the GitHub repo for the foreman gem. And the main branch for the foreman gem currently has like a working copy of code, thankfully. They probably test their stuff, and it'll allow us to run our bin/dev on Ruby 3.2. Now, if you're not on Ruby 3.2, it's not going to be a problem. So don't worry about it if you're not on 3.2, or if you're in the future and they've already fixed it. So right now it's not a supported version, but it's also not that big of a deal. So once we have all of that, we can go ahead and do a bundle install. That should hopefully work. And then we should be good to run a bin/dev real quick to make sure that everything's working. We'll go over to localhost port 3000. Looks like it is. And then we can go ahead and stop the server again. So the next thing we want to do is we want to generate our scaffold for our post. So we'll say Rails G scaffold post with a title and a body of type text. We can go ahead and run that. And then we want to do a Rails G stimulus, and we want to call this the search controller. So that's where we're going to do our JavaScript stuff. After we have that, we can then go ahead and hit F11 again. Come over to our DB and our seeds file, And in our seeds, I'm going to just kind of paste in some code here because nobody wants to watch me do this database seeding every time. We're just going to say we want 25 posts. Each post should have a title, which we're just setting to a fake book title, and then it should have a body with 2 sentences for its body. And then after these posts are created, we then want to run a post.reindex to make sure that we're indexing these posts in our database as you would expect them to be. The next thing we want to do is we want to come into, I guess, our app, our models, and our post.rb, and we want to say that this has Searchkick. And I think we also want to say that we want to do some text matching with the middle of the word or the middle of the text for the title and the body. So this will allow us to do stuff where we type, like ID and we'll get matched with middle, for example. So that's pretty cool. And then once all of that's done, we can go ahead and try to run a railsdb:/seed command to hopefully, we have to run a railsdb:/migrate and then a db:/seed command to hopefully get our stuff set up. And it's not erroring out, which means it's probably working. Cool. Let's go ahead and let's run a bin/dev to start our server. Okay, let's come over here and let's go into our config and our routes.rb. Inside of our routes, we need to create a couple. The first one, of course, is the root of the application. We then want to have the post search path. This will allow us to post a search request to the search controller and the search action. In this case, you could also make it the index action if you're so inclined, which means we are going to need a search controller. We can do that real quick. We can come up to our controllers, right click, new file, search_controller.rb. And then we can just do this class for the search controller. And if you want, you can even call it the index action. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we can grab this index action, come into our routes, and we can change this to be the search controller index action. And we just want it to be as the search_path, for example. Okay, so now that we have that, we can also add a route because we're going to be doing the suggestions for the auto completion. We're going to be doing something similar to this where we have the post for the search, but instead we're going to do this for the search/suggestions. This will go to the search controller and the suggestions path, and we want this to be as the search_suggestions. There we go. And that's just so it's a bit more readable. We can then come over here, we can save our search controller, and then let's refresh the page to make sure we're on the home page. So it looks like we are, but of course we're using Tailwind, so everything's going to look super ugly. So let's go ahead and let's clean this up real quick so that we can have something that's a bit more usable as we go through this. So to do that, we're going to come into our posts. And before we do anything else, I'm going to right click and create a _posts.html.erb partial. We can come into our index page. And basically what we want to do is we want to cut out this @posts iteration, and we'll just do a render for posts/posts. And then we'll pass in the @posts just like that. And then for this div with an ID, we'll also give it a class equal to mt-4 and mx-10, which will give us some top and left-right padding. And then we can come into our _posts, paste this in and save it. We can save our index page. We'll go ahead and refresh. You'll see that already moves stuff over a little bit, makes it a little bit more readable. I can also zoom out to like 150. I don't know why I was zoomed in so much. Next thing I want to do is grab the title, and I want to add in some classes here. Again, if you're not using Tailwind, you can pretty much skip the CSS. You can also pretty much skip the CSS if you just don't care about it. And then, of course, we can add in the div for our search bar, which will give a flex and a center. And for this one, we're going to be doing a render for a partial where we have the search/form, which means we need a search folder in our views. So say search. And then our form is going to be the _form.html.erb. That's where a lot of our logic's going to happen. And then for our locals, we're just passing in an empty array. That way we can use the results as we move on. So at this point, I think we're pretty much done with the index page. So that's pretty cool. Let's now come into our posts partial because we kind of want to clean this up a bit. So to get started, we want to wrap the entire thing up here with a div, and we can actually get rid of the render for the posts. Let me go ahead and close this div and move it down here. And the reason why we got rid of that is just because I want to do the, h2 for the post, and a p tag for the body, just like this. And now if we refresh, you'll see that things are broken up a little bit more and it looks a little bit better. But let's make these links blue just so we have something that looks vaguely like a real application. There we go. Okay, so that's enough of the styling for the posts. Let's move on to the form, I guess. So this is where we start getting into some of the nitty-gritties of how this is going to work. So basically, we need to do our form with where we pass in a URL, which is going to be our search path. And remember, that goes to our search controller index action. We need this to be a method of post because we defined it as a method of post, and also because we're posting data there, or I guess posting a request there. And then we're going to give this a width of 60, which is just a way for us to horizontally align things. And then we can do our data block. At the end here, we also want to do a form. That way we can mess around with the form. For our data, we want to bind this to the search controller, which is our application or JavaScript controllers and our search controller.js file. And then we want to give this a action where we say on key up, we want this to be the search controller. This is our stimulus search controller and the suggestions action. And then the final thing we have to do here is we want to bind the suggestions URL. That way we can use it in our stimulus controller. Now, that's not necessarily something we're going to do right now, but it is important to get that out of the way. Next thing we want to do is create a div with a class of relative. And then we want to do the input for our search. So we're going to make this the query parameter. So we can just grab the query in our search controller. And then we need to give this some data as well. So we'll just do a data block just like this. We can come down here. And then for this data, we want to give it a search target. This will allow us to basically do a document.getElementById in the JavaScript. And then the other thing we can do is a action, again, similar to this one, but this time it's going to be a blur for search hide suggestions, which is just going to work if we like click off of the input, it'll fire the blur event. Okay, now the last thing for this specific element is going to be a really ugly Tailwind class. So let's go ahead and let's do that. And let me hide the side panel here. Basically, because Tailwind loves to work like inline styling and it's kind of gross, I'm just going to kind of scroll through this. Feel free to pause it and use it as you see fit. I'll also have the source code in the video description so you don't have to go through this. But after we have that, we can then add a comma. We can do a placeholder where we say search ... and then we can do a autocomplete of off, which will stop the Google autocomplete from firing, or your browser's autocomplete. Okay, so that's kind of one of the worst parts of this entire setup, is dealing with the Tailwind here. But after we have that, we can then come down here and we can tab this over so it matches. What we can do now is we can grab a class for our submit button. So we'll do a div, just like that. And this will put our submit button inside of the search box. We can go ahead and tab this over. And again, I'll just scroll through it. The CSS is kind of self-explanatory. If you just like mess around with it, remove some stuff, you'll see what it does. But basically you're just making this match this thing's width. And you'll see what this looks like in a second here. But okay, we now can come down here. Outside of this this form submit div, we can do another div with a ID equal to suggestions. So we can say suggestions. And then for this one, what we can do is we can give it a class of this. And then we can come down here. And because I usually do this in just one way, here I'm going to do it in two ways. It's not clean code to do it like this, but I'm also going to show you how to do the stimulus bindings in just raw HTML. And this is sort of how you do it. So instead of doing like search underscore target, you do data dash search dash target, which is what this actually generates under the hood. So it is nice to see this working, but for this one, we're just going to do it as the suggestions target so that we can get this by using the suggestions keyword. And then we'll do a data dash action for the mouse down where we do a search controller and a child clicked action. So the way this will work is when we do the drop-down menu, if we click in the drop-down menu, we don't want this action to hide the drop-down menu. We only want to hide the drop-down menu if we're clicking off of the search menu. And there's actually an even better way to do it than this blur. I just want to show you how to use the blur first, and then we'll do it the other way. But okay, now that we have that, we can come in here and we can do a render for a partial, and the partial will be the search controller, or the search and the suggestions. And then this will be for the locals, and then we'll do the results, should be the results. So we're just going to pass in whatever our results are here. Okay, so this part right here, the results is what allows us to have them when we go back. That's pretty neat. Now, if we come over here and we refresh, we'll see that we're missing the search suggestions partial. So let's come into our search underscore suggestions .html.erb. And then in our suggestions partial, we want to check if we have any results. This stops us from running into issues if results is empty. We then want to make sure that we have the CSS set up here. This is what allows us to have that scroll bar if we have more than like 5.5 results. Then we grab the results and iterate through them, just like this. And then for each of these results, we put them in a link or in a div. And then inside of that div, we have a link to the post itself with a class of text blue 500. Go ahead and refresh. We now have our search bar appearing here. I know that's a lot of setup, but it kind of gets rid of a lot of the stuff that's like pretty redundant. I mean, if you watch one of my tutorials, you've probably watched 20 of them and you've probably seen this 20 times. So this part's kind of, you know, overdone at this point. So instead, we're just going to skip through it. So this allows us to have our search, but we're not going to be firing to the backend yet because the backend's not doing anything. So we have to make sure we're doing that. If we come into our search controller, we can handle this pretty quickly. So the first thing we want to do is in our index action, we want to grab the @results. And if the params query is blank, we actually want to return the post.all. So if we like don't have anything in our search bar, if we like backspace, we want it to just return all posts. And then for the post.search, we can pass in the params query. We can also specify which fields we'd like to use. There's also an option for misspelling, but we're not going to use that. And instead what we'll do is we'll just say the operator should be the or, which allows us, if we search for something like test and case in the title, it will return a post with title of test or a post with title of case, something like that. You can also do and if you're so inclined, right? Doesn't really matter. We'll just leave it as an or for now. And then the last thing, which is the key, we want this to be match with the text underscore middle, just like that. So we're actually going to be reusing this in our suggestions method. So what we'll do is we'll just say search for posts, right? We can come down here for a private def search for posts. We can go ahead and pass this in and it'll return this as expected. And then after we have these results, we then want to once again do a turbo respond to. So for this respond to, what we want to do, and it looks like my formatter is completely broken. What we want to do here is format turbo stream do. We then want to render a turbo stream. And then for this turbo stream, what we want to do is say turbo underscore stream dot update the posts ID. So again, if we come into our post index real quick, just to take a look at what this looks like. In our post index, we wrap all of our posts inside of a div with an ID of posts, which is what we're targeting here. We then say, all right, what should we put in there? Well, we want to put our posts partial. So we're replacing the contents of this, whatever's inside of this div, with the post partial, which conveniently for us is already inside of there. That's why we set it up like this. But as you can see in our index, we have the comma posts, so we have to pass those in. And luckily for us, we do that with the locals where we pass in our results. That allows us to update these as needed. So now if we come over here and we refresh and we type the word test and we click search, we'll get a undefined method each for the @posts inside of our post partial, because I forgot to change the @posts right here to just being posts, because we're passing in the local of posts without this @ symbol. This is what we're passing in, and this is what we're renaming it to. So I should use it like what we renamed it to instead of what it was named. Let's go ahead and let's search for test. And now we should get fewer results. It looks like we are getting some interesting results though, which maybe if we create a new post and we try this again, let's go ahead and let's do a test and a case. And of course with Tailwind, you're gonna have to restyle your forms and stuff. But now if we search for test, we now get the test result, and then we get some others that it thinks matches, which makes sense because this one has like EST inside of it. This also has EST in it. So it looks like it's just doing some vague matching, which is fine. Okay, so we can also search for case. So that works. Now let's do the autocomplete suggestions. Now the autocomplete suggestions are a little bit more involved. Basically, all of this can be handled with Turbo. The autocomplete, you could do it that way, but with a lot of the blurring, we're gonna have to use some stimulus magic here too. Although I'm sure there's a better way to do this. So the first thing we want to do is in our stimulus controller, let me save the post partial. In the stimulus controller, we want to define a list of static targets. And then we want to create some methods that we've defined previously. The first one that we defined, I think, is in our posts form somewhere, or in our search form. In our search form, we have this suggestions method that we call whenever a key up is detected. So whenever we get done pressing a key while we're typing, we call this method. So what we want to do is create a suggestions. And then in here, we can do something like this. Because we have our input target, we can actually declare a const of query and set it equal to this.input target. And because we have our suggestions URL, which we set up in our form right here, this right here, we can grab this by doing a this.element.dataset.suggestions URL, and we can call this .element.dataset because we're binding this to the form, which means the element is this form, and the dataset allows us to access the suggestions URL. Okay, and then after that, what we want to do is we want to debounce this request. So we'll say clear timeout, just like that. We'll call it this.timeout, and then we declare a variable that is this.timeout. And then down here, we can give this a timeout with 1000 being 1 second, because this is in milliseconds. Because we want to test this more quickly for the sake of this video, I'm going to put it to 250, which is a quarter of a second. And then we're going to call this.request suggestions and pass in these two parameters. So we come down here and we say request suggestions. And then for this request suggestions method, the first thing we want to do is check if our query length is equal to 0. We then want to call a function to hide our suggestions and return. Now, hiding our suggestions is an interesting dilemma. Basically, this is going to be the thing that hides the suggestions dropdown. However, we do need to make sure that we are hiding this only when we want to. So we're going to have to change this logic a little bit. For now, we'll just say this.suggestionsTarget.classlist.addHidden, which will hide it. And then we'll have to decide when we want to show it. But let's say we have a query of length greater than 0. We then want to show our suggestions because we might have hidden it previously, right? So let's go down here. Let's create a show suggestions. And it'll just be the exact opposite with the word remove instead. And that allows us to move on with our lives. Now, finally, we can do our fetch request. Our fetch request is going to take in our URL. It's going to need a method of post. It's going to need some headers with a content type of application/JSON and the XCSRF token, which is how Rails makes sure that this is an authentic request. And then we can pass in a body with a JSON.stringify where we pass in the query with the name of query. This will then allow us to come down here and do a, what is it? A brace and then parentheses dot, and then we should be able to get a response. And then for this response, we can, let me make sure I'm grabbing the right thing here. Instead of doing this, we're going to grab a set of braces. We can do a response.text dot then with the HTML. And then what we can do is we can grab the document.body.insert adjacent HTML before end and then pass in the HTML. And the reason why we do this is because we're going to get a response back with our turbo, and we kind of need to handle that from the stimulus controller, which is a little bit messy, as you can imagine. But it allows us to do a lot of this logic inside of our stimulus controller. So when we get the response back from our search controller, it will respond with this turbo stream for a suggestions, def suggestions action. And then we want to basically just append it to the document wherever it needs to go, which the stimulus turbo stuff will figure out on its own with this magic piece of code here. That said, we need to implement the suggestions method right here. Now this one, we can thankfully just grab our @results again, just like that. And then we can do another respond to. So what we'll actually do is we'll grab this respond to block, and we'll just change the parts we want. So we want to replace the posts with the suggestions. The search suggestions is the partial we want to use. And then we want to pass in the results as the @results. This will correspond to the suggestions ID, which in our form, we have the ID with suggestions. So it's going to replace the contents of this, which again is just a partial. And you can see this partial looks exactly like our search controller partial that we're establishing here. So it'll replace it with whatever's in here, which will iterate through all of our results. Cool. Now that said, if we try this, let's refresh and hit Control-Shift-I. If we type in the word test, for example, you'll see that right now we're not really getting anything showing up. And we can see here that we're not firing our request suggestions method when we try to do this. So our suggestions is not firing from our form. So in our form right here, where we have the key up, this should be key up and not just key. That's my bad. If we come in here and we refresh, hopefully, if we refresh, should then be able to type in T, and we should start seeing these results. Let me full screen this, scroll in a bit. So you can see here as I type the results, we get newer results, but if we click off, it clicks away. If we type in test again though, we try to click on test, you'll see that we instantly run into an issue, which is our child click doesn't exist. If you don't have child clicked, it'll also not work though, because the blur event's gonna hide it before the click event happens. So we have to create this child clicked event real quick and change some of our logic. So for the child clicked, it's pretty simple. We just come in here wherever we want, maybe above the show suggestions. For the child clicked, we just want to say this dot child was clicked is equal to this dot element dot contains event dot target. So when we click on the child, we are clicking on a child of the form, right? So when the form is clicked, we check if the form contains the child. If it does, we're good to go. However, if we click on over here, the form doesn't contain this as a child because the body is the parent, so then it'll hide it. That said, we need to use this variable in our hide suggestion so that this doesn't fire all the time. To do this, what we can do is we can say if the child was not clicked, we then want to hide it. And then after that, we can just set this dot child was clicked equal to false. So that cleans up some of our logic there. So now if we come over here and we refresh, we search for test, we click in here, it now works and we can visit it. That said, if we search for test, click in here and then click off, you'll see that we're not hiding it. So there's got to be a better way to do it, because the blur event's only going to fire when we have the input focused and then we click away for the first time, right? So that's something that we have to think about, is how do we get this to hide whenever we click off the thing in general? And the way we can do that is inside of our connect method, we can create a document.addEventListener, and then we can do this. Oops, I don't know what GitHub Copilot's doing. Well, we can come in here and we can say if the element does not contain the event.target, same way we're checking for the child in the other place, we can just call this .hide suggestions instead. And this will work a lot better than our blur check, because if we search for test, we click in here, we click off, it still works. If we search for test again, and I don't know, we just click off, that works too. If we, search for SFD and then we scroll through here, we click on the bar, that works, and eventually we click off, it'll just get rid of it. So to me, this is the one that makes a lot more sense and gives us sort of the functionality that we're after. Okay, so I know this was a longer one, but hopefully this showed you a couple things you can do. I know we had to go a little bit fast there, but that's mostly just because there's a lot to cover to get something like this working. But hopefully this was interesting, hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.